Hello and welcome to this NEASC Virtual Global Forum, Assessment and Grading During COVID-19. We are so glad you have joined us as we explore this important topic with NEASC educators across the world. We have had a tremendous response with over 1,800 attendees registered from over 40 countries. My name is Cameron Staples. I'm the CEO of NEASC. Working with me today is my colleague, Allison Geary. Allison is the Deputy Director of the Commission on Public Schools at NEASC. This forum is the fourth in a planned series. Each of our forums focuses on a specific topic. We ask participants for questions in advance during the registration process, and we'll use those questions as we focus on today's topic. We will continue to address additional questions as we move on to future webinars. Our forums are designed to use the global reach of our organization and bring together educators from independent, international, and public schools. We've created the hashtag @NEASC Forum and encourage you to use it when sharing your thoughts from today's discussion on social media. Access webinar recordings and view the upcoming dates of our webinars on our website. A few words about NEASC and our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We want to start by thanking all of you for the incredible work you are doing to continue learning for your students. Many of you are also providing for your students other needs. We understand the unprecedented gravity of the situation and the added responsibilities and stress facing school leaders and teachers around the world. We encourage you to reach out to the professional staff at NEASC if you have specific questions about your school's accreditation. We are here and we are happy to help. A little bit about our format today. The NEASC Virtual Global Forum is a webinar and not a Zoom meeting. Because of the large number of people involved, attendees are view-only participants. Attendees can interact with the host and the panelists through the Q&A and communicate with other attendees using the chat feature. Please use the chat to say hello to your colleagues, but use the Q&A just for questions for the panelists. We will be monitoring the question and answer and chat features during our webinar. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Abby Benedetto, a deeper learning coach with Envision Learning Partners. Stacy Caldwell, the Chief Executive Officer at Mastery Transcript Consortium. And Dr. Julie Hackett, the Superintendent of the Public Schools in Lexington, Massachusetts. Thank you all for being here. I'd now like to turn it over to Allison, who will begin the conversation.
Thank you, Cam, and welcome to everyone. It looks like we have almost 1,000 people on the webinar so far. It's very, very exciting. We're so pleased to have our panelists with us this morning. Our goal today is to talk about assessment and grading practices in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we start, can I have each of our panelists introduce themselves and give us a brief description of the organization that they work for? Julie, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Abby and Stacy.
Good morning, everyone. I am the superintendent of schools in Lexington, Massachusetts. It's a town of about 35,000 people. We have a rich history. We were the place where the first shots of the American Revolutionary War Battle of Lexington happened. We have 10 schools, very diverse. It's a well-educated community, about 1,500 staff members, and approximately 7,300 incredible students in Lexington.
Great, thank you. Abby?
Hi, my name is Abby Benedetto, and I'm a deeper learning coach for Envision Learning Partners. Envision Learning Partners works with schools and districts all over the country to set up systems of performance assessment. But really what that means is we get to think and create and build with school and district leaders who are trying to center the 21st century authentic, transferable skills that we know students need when they leave school. And then we try to figure out how we can set up systems of assessment that actually measure those.
Terrific, thank you. Stacy?
Good morning. My name is Stacy Caldwell. I am the CEO of the Mastery Transcript Consortium, MTC for short. The MTC is a growing network of public and private schools who are really transforming the high school experience and are introducing a digital high school transcript that truly tells the story of each student's unique strengths, abilities, and interests.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So one of the topics we wanted to discuss today was the implications for grading during this unprecedented time. I know that a lot of school administrators have questions about what to do about grading right now. So Stacy, I know your organization has recently released some guidance for schools and districts in the US about grading for the rest of the year. Would you like to talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure, that would be great. I'd love the opportunity to do that. So let me go ahead and share. So just to start with 30 more seconds on who the MTC is and what we do. As I mentioned, growing network of schools, about 313, and growing public and independent schools, and frankly, all over in the US and all over the globe. And these are schools that are really reimagining what school can be and understand the role that grading and outcomes can really take in both helping along and in some cases constraining those efforts. Just to give you a sense for the sort of the transcript that our schools have started using this year. The MTC was founded on the idea that the traditional transcript and the traditional grading system, by which I mean letter grades for single subject work, really can hold back the type of learning that can be possible in high school. So when schools, like schools in our network, partner with their communities to really allow students to solve authentic problems, when schools introduce a range of learning experiences and students customize their work to really align with their passions, that work doesn't always fit into tidy subject and hours boxes. So we as an organization fully believe that the traditional grading system should be looked at more broadly, and that the focus should always be on supporting and guiding student learning, really meeting students where they are and supporting them with what they need to achieve, both against really rigorous sets of expectations and their full potential. Now, in this moment and in this context of COVID-19, there's a whole range of new variables that all of our member schools and all schools, frankly, are facing. We know that all students need new and additional supports as we move to distance learning. We know that all the traditional inequities that we see in the system are being exacerbated, quite frankly, and also new inequities are developing. So we work together with Challenge Success and Crescendo Education to put together a guiding statement for schools. You can find that at bit.ly/MTC grade info. And just remember that bit.lys are case sensitive, so make sure the MTC is capitalized there. The guidance really falls into 4 categories, but is based in the idea that of really focusing on student support and finding the right equitable answer for your community. So the guidance, we recommend that all schools shift to credit or incomplete, no record grading. So move away from letter grades and move to credit incomplete. That schools communicate to their students and their staff that fostering a climate of care and connection is the highest priority. Learning cannot happen if students do not have a basic sense of wellness. And so fostering that climate of care and connection is most important. We encourage communities to do everything they can to ensure equal access and support for technology and tools, and to provide clear guidelines for teachers and students that less is more, really focusing in on what students need to know. I'll finish up with, I know we're going to talk a little bit more broadly about assessment, and I'll look forward to the questions there. But as we think about moving from grading into assessment and what that really means, one of the things that we as an organization encourage folks to do, and that we see many of our schools really engaging in sort of deep, interesting conversations, is first stepping back, keeping your focus on supporting and guiding student learning again, but really thinking about what assessment means. An assessment is, if you step back from it, we all tend to think of it right now as tests, or in some cases even multiple choice tests. But assessment really is the process of observing learning, and should and can be part of the learning process. So the deepest questions are, what do we really need students to know? And then what are the myriad of ways that we can observe that? So for example, a student who does a math exercise, yes, there's information in what the results of that exercise are, but there's deeper information in the student reflecting on, hey, you know what? I really struggled in the first 5 questions, then I got it, then I really figured out that, I knew what I was doing and I was just practicing and getting more fluent. That's a student who understands and has observed what they're doing. There are a range of resources out there. One of the resources that I tend to go back to is work that David Conley, who was a professor out in Oregon, actually put together Oregon's performance assessments in the 90s. He put out a new book a couple of years ago. called The Promise and Practice of Next Generation Assessment. He has a number of principles, but I think a few that really drive home as folks frame up the way they're thinking about this. Make sure that you're focused on learner needs. Students are not an object here, they should be part of the process, and make sure that we're designing for equity from the beginning. Promote student ownership of learning. Think about both the structure and integration of knowledge. And then this last one I find really important is this concept of cumulative validity. You as a teacher, you as a school, often know very well what students know how to do and don't know how to do, and you should think about the range of resources and how that builds over time into what would be traditionally a more technical term of cumulative validity. So with that, I will pause. Thank you. I really thank NEASC, Allison, and Cam for pulling this together, Abby and Julie for joining the panel, and I'm looking forward to the questions a little later.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Stacy. Just as a reminder to the participants, we'd like to use the Q&A for questions that you might have for the panelists, that we'll be looking at those later on, and use the chat just for participants to communicate with one another. So put your hellos and your highs in the chat, and then if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. You can also look at the Q&A and vote for questions, upvote questions that you think are really important, and then we'll make sure that we take a look at those questions. All right. So I'd like to I'd like to turn the time over to Julie. Julie, I know your district, the Lexington Public Schools in Lexington, Massachusetts, has made the decision to go pass-fail for student grades for the rest of the year. Could you tell us a little bit about that decision and what factors went into making it?
Sure, and if I could, I'd like to start with a quote by one of our parents who is in Lexington and wrote the book Blended. It's Michael Horn. And Michael says that the good news amidst a sea of bad news with the COVID-19 pandemic is that there may now exist an opportunity to begin to reset our nation's focus on inputs over individual student outcomes. And I think this is important in terms of how we have begun to approach our system in Lexington. So we developed a remote learning plan on around March 13th. And we said in that plan that the most important outcome for our students is to feel cared for and supported by their teachers, and for them to be meaningfully engaged in learning activities for at least some portion of the day. We wanted our teachers to stay in touch with students and families during what is obviously a very difficult time with this pandemic. And we wanted them to provide support and guidance and encouragement along the way. And so we set up a system that is very different from the one that we currently know in traditional schools. And we asked people to first consider the realities of the situation that we exist in. So we have students who are participating in self-directed learning in alternative educational settings with a lot less structure. They don't have a teacher there. They have lots of other things happening in their lives. We have parents and caregivers who can't be expected to deliver the content because they may not know the content. And even if they do know the content of what's being taught, they may not have the pedagogical skills. Just as an example, elementary math today is completely different than the way we learned math before. And also in terms of equity, which Stacy mentioned, we have parents and caregivers who are juggling work or working from home. They're taking care of young children. They're dealing with illnesses. And the same is true for our staff. So creating a system where we can ensure that people can access it, that learning can continue, albeit in different ways, is what we worked at designing. So what we said was that learning would be significantly shorter. It would be reduced by about half. And we want our teachers to work in grade level teams and in interdisciplinary teams, and to really take advantage of the new strategic plan that we have in place with lots of interesting language, and I'll mention that in a bit. And we talked with our staff about, and in our parent community about, for them to be able to provide the same level of support that they would if they were, say, helping with homework or something like that, but not becoming the teacher, which is, I think, more challenging in this environment as we all get used to what's happening. And so we said that the work doesn't need to be graded. It doesn't need to count toward a report card per se, but feedback, and lots of it can and should be given for student submitted work. We want regular and ongoing communication, and we did develop a pass, fail, and incomplete system, incomplete grading sort of system. It's not grading, it's actually just our educators give a pass, fail, or an incomplete. And what we've discovered is that, first of all, change in any school system is incredibly difficult, but there's a real opportunity in adversity. I think what's been so interesting for me at least is that we took about 18 months to develop a strategic plan that really engaged our entire community, our parents, our staff, our educators, our students, and we came up with these, I think, really amazing pillars for our vision, where we say that everybody has a right to a rigorous education, and that's kind of the diversity, equity, and inclusion pillar. We talk about redefining success. We say that in Lexington, we've expanded our definition of success beyond traditional notions of student achievement. The third pillar is students as active agents, where we want students out and in charge of their own learning through dynamic and interactive learning experiences where they may help their community. We want them to be authentic learning experiences. That's our fourth pillar, where they're actually giving back to the community. And we have all of this great language in place to support the current environment that we're in. And the irony is that it's really tough for people to make the transition. So the pass-fail system has been interesting for us, and I think it is the right type of learning. I mentioned Michael Horn at the beginning. He talks about the value that's placed upon time on learning and seat time, and how difficult it is for our school communities to really embrace a different way of learning. And I was reminded of a recent visit to MIT Lincoln Labs, where superintendents in our area organized a visit. It was great. They had students, actually students, they're young college graduates there who were working. And as superintendents, we asked them, you know, what's most important in terms of your education when you look back on high school? And the young college graduates talked about everything other than the traditional types of education. They talked about the extracurricular types of learning experiences, or the learning experiences that were less structured, and what they were able to gain by kind of taking control of their own learning and finding joy in their learning, which is our mission in Lexington: joy in learning, curiosity in life, and compassion in all we do. And we think this time in our educational journey is really helping us get closer to our mission, and same with the pass-fail system.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Julie. Can I just was looking at one of the questions from a attendee that said, will the final grade for the second semester be a pass-fail grade? And yeah, so I guess that's the question. Is that what it will say in the transcript?
It will be pass-fail unless we return to school, at which case we'll have to figure out how we blend the grades, and we're talking about those types of things now. But if we're to be out of school for the remainder of the year, it would be a pass-fail grade. And I think this is, I didn't say it in my remarks earlier, but it's a great opportunity to start thinking about what happens at middle school and high school level. Our elementary students are already dealing in a standards-based world. They're growing up, they're going to be in middle and high school soon. I think one of the first discussions we had was, wouldn't it be so cool if this could become a launch pad for a different way of assessing at middle and high school? So more to come on that.
Great. Yes, and I think we've used two terms. We've used pass-fail. We've also used credit, no credit, or even not recorded. I think there are some schools who are, or for some students, taking courses off the transcript if they feel that they can't complete that course. I also, there's some questions about in the Q&A about college acceptances and admittances. We're not going to talk about that today, but we did a whole webinar last week on that with college admissions counselors. And essentially what they said is that they're not going to hold any students, they're not going to negatively impact students that have a pass-fail or credit, no credit on their transcripts, that they'll be looking at other aspects of the transcript, and they're not going to hold any students, that's not going to harm students in the application process. So if you want to view that webinar, the link is on our website. You can go there and take a look at that. And again, a lot of really good information pertaining to college. We won't go over that again today, but that was the general consensus from those college counselors. All right, so let's go to Abby. Abby, we have worked at NEASC, have worked with Abby over the last several years. She's done a lot of our Vision of the Graduate workshops and talked a lot with our members about skills and the importance of thinking about the skills that students are learning. So we know that traditional types of assessments will likely be less effective in this online space. So I want to just shift the conversation and have Abby talk a little bit more about her work and the types of deeper learning assessments that her organization encourages teachers and schools to use. Abby?
Thank you, Allison. And thank you so much for Stacy and Julie. You guys have just like set things up perfectly. I feel like I can sort of skip through a bunch of things that I was planning on saying. So I'm just gonna move into sharing my screen, and then I'm gonna add the resources in the chat. Everything that I'm gonna show you today here, we have available for everybody if you're interested on the internet. So like I said, I work for Envision Learning Partners. You can see the website right there. Actually, you can find all of our resources there at envisionlearning.org. And we talk a lot about performance assessment. And so I just wanted to offer the way that we think about this and what that means. We say that performance assessment is the demonstration and evaluation of applied transferable skills that can be taught and learned. So the idea is that more traditional forms of assessment measure content, but performance assessment measures skills. We've actually developed some indicators of what we think high quality performance assessment is as well. And so what we say that what that means is it elicits evidence of learning that matters. It's tight on criteria for success, but also open to different learner approaches. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's really how we speak towards equity and access. We really think it needs to be authentic as possible. And the idea is that it should be a learning experience in and of itself. Sometimes more traditional forms of assessment is that one and done, you sit and take a test and you're done. But performance assessment often allows students to reflect on their process as well as their product along the way, and then try something again. It builds a culture of revision. So for example, some sort of performance assessments can come in the form of student-led conferences, a portfolio defense or a capstone project, or a more general exhibition of learning. It can also come in different forms, but these are some of the most common ones. I'm going to be talking the most today about portfolio defense, but really you can sort of use these interchangeably when we're talking about performance assessment at this level. What we found is that in this time of COVID-19, a lot of our client schools, as we move to distance learning, educators are sitting with this question of, how do we know if they are just Googling the answers? We're sort of racked with this idea of if we give a test to students in a virtual space, how do we know that they're the ones doing the work? And what Envision Learning Partners would say is that might mean that we're giving the wrong type of test right now. When we are in general school, we're used to having a teacher in front of the classroom watching students do the work as they go. But actually what we're saying is that in this time, we might want to shift the question to this one. How do we know what students know in a virtual environment? And we sort of think that the best way to do that is to take this as an opportunity to use performance assessment. We think that this is a moment to really meet the needs of all of our students. As Julie was saying, we have students who are faced with an environment that they've never faced before. Some of them are maybe having to take over parenting skills for their siblings. Some of them are having to manage, budgets for families who have been impacted economically. And some are just dealing with sort of this lack of structured time or lack of an adult who's leading them through a learning experience. So this is really a moment to meet the needs of all of our students. And we can do that by building and creating new solutions, centering the experience of our most marginalized students. I think it's really important that as we sort of think about shifting and doing things differently, we center those voices who we don't normally hear as loudly perhaps, and whose experiences might be the most impacted by the COVID-19 time. We also feel like this is an opportunity to redefine how we gather data, right? So many of us in school systems have historically relied on some of those standardized testing, the SBAC, SAT, all of these different tests to say, oh, this is the Lexile that this student is in, or this is how I know what this student knows. And this is a chance to really redefine what data we gather and how we use that data. So we think that a virtual portfolio defense is a really good option to do that. And so we've designed a toolkit, and this is what you can find online. I'll put it in the chat as soon as I'm done, because we're trying to just help folks to figure out if they want to do this. Our most guiding principle that if you remember one thing, I would hope it would be this, that the idea is if we can get tight on criteria, really figure out what it is that you're going to try to measure with any assessment that you're doing in this time, but then be loose on path. Allow students to sort of get to that assessment in various ways. We think that that's going to sort of guide you along the path. When we've designed this toolkit, the first thing we do is we start clients with sort of thinking about hopes and assets. Really start there. How do you want students to feel? We've heard so many times that students are actually in this moment of deep loss, right? We have seniors who don't have any of those traditional rites of passage that you normally get with a senior year. And so we can design assessments with the idea of how we want students to feel in mind, and actually what we value. These assessments will signal to our communities what we value. This is not necessarily the time to go broad and to say we're going to assess everything that we think students need to know. It's a chance to say, you know what, these are the 3 things that we really care about right now, and so we're going to really try to assess those. And then you can move over to what assets you and students have. We've heard from so many students that are thinking about this credit, no credit situation. They're like, but I've done all this work, doesn't that matter? We can design assessments where students can bring that work that they've already done to the forefront and do some reflection about what they think it means and what it says about what they know. We then feel like when you start with hopes and assets, you might be at a general decision point. For some folks, this might be entirely new, and so you're going to sort of start at maybe a level 1 virtual assessment that might look more like a student-led conference that happens virtually, where a student is online with a parent and a teacher or some type of family member, and are just reflecting about some pieces of work and what they think that work says about them. Other people might already have a vision of a graduate or a graduate profile that you've been building towards. You might have a set of shared rubrics. You might have even been already planning or holding defenses. And so now this is a time to sort of create a virtual version of that, where students can do some sort of presentation online. And then for some folks, you might have been doing portfolio defenses or capstone projects for years, and maybe this is a chance to actually sort of blow it out of the water. We've talked to some schools that are like, yeah, we're gonna live stream student defenses on a YouTube channel or things like that. So this is really a chance where you could sort of innovate and allow students to take the wheel. We've sort of designed these we come up with these design principles, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but I really think that these are the things that we think if schools who are trying to redesign assessment for this time of COVID-19 think about these things, you're going to be getting towards an assessment that's really going to be meaningful, authentic, and measure what matters. The only one I want to talk about is that first one of students designing how they want to show up. This feels so deeply meaningful for me because, again, it's all about equity and access. If you say, here is what we're trying to assess students, we're really going to lean into how well you've been a critical thinker or a self-directed learner or whatever, then students can say, you know what? I don't know that I have a really quiet space in my house, so I'm going to actually pre-record a video and then call you on the phone so we can have a question and answer. Or I'm going to make sure that I actually build a backdrop behind me, not even the virtual one, but I'm going to do it for real because I want to show you my creativity. But if we allow students to really lead us in how they want to show up to this assessment, we think that that's going to speak to all these issues around equity and marginalization because of this this time, and really also challenge students to sort of make this their own. So the last thing I just want to say is right now we have a fleet of tools. We've got an overview of the virtual portfolio defense. We've got a student-facing planning tool, as well as a path-paced tool that's designed more for the adults in the system. And we're continuing to build tools and release them as we hear from needs that we're finding in the field. And so we're really excited to share this with you, and I'm excited to talk about how you all are reacting to this and what questions you have.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a lot, right? A lot in a short period of time. Abby could do a day-long seminar on all of this information, but I really encourage you to go to her website, go to that link and take a look at those assessments, because some of the questions that have been coming up are, what does an authentic performance-based assessment look like in this virtual space? And I think she has a lot of good ideas and tools for that. Stacy, we had someone who had a question or wanted to know a little bit more about the cumulative validity idea. And I think that sort of relates to what Abby was talking about from the perspective of, thinking about how do we know what students know? Could you talk a little bit more about that, Stacy? And then if either of you have, or if Julie or Abby have other thoughts.
Sure. So in the sort of academic assessment space, as people think about assessments, there's two terms that come up a lot. One is reliability, the other is validity. Reliability just means is an answer repeatable? Could you reliably get the same answer for students over and over and over again? Validity is, are you testing the construct and able to actually figure out an answer? Sort of for a narrowly defined construct, do you have an answer that you think actually represents that? And have you put together the assessment in a way that, that can get to that? So if we take that sort of definition of validity and back up a little bit, what is the real question here is, how do you get to a valid sense of what a student knows? And so the idea of cumulative validity is just, if you simplify it, is the idea that as a school, as an instructor, even as an individual learner, that builds over time. And so cumulative validity may look like, if you're trying to do a communication, understand how well a student communicates, well, a writing assignment may play into that. A conversation online, as Abby was just talking about, and learning how the student shows up, what creativity they bring, and how they communicate, either through a video or one-on-one, could be something that adds to your knowledge about how a student communicates. A speech and debate performance could be an example of something that adds to your understanding of how well a student communicates. And so the idea of cumulative validity is, rather than getting really hung up on, oh, I need a test with a certain construct, instead it's backing up and saying, over time, what are the assets, what are the tools, what's the data that you really have in place to build up a sense for that, a sense for what a student really knows.
Great, thank you. And to relate to that, some people are talking about final exams. Julie, do you have any thoughts, or have you talked in your district about final exams? I know someone mentioned that maybe the governor was interested in bringing kids back so they could take final exams at the end of the year to see what they know, which seems a little bit mean for students. Have you had any conversations about final exams or final assessments for this year?
We're beginning to have those conversations. We don't have plans in place yet. Just, I will say, in response to bringing kids back now to take exams, when we think about reliability and validity of assessments, I can't imagine that that's a good idea, but that's my own personal opinion and belief. But I think things are going to have to change if we continue to be engaging in remote learning. We need to rethink everything, and the learning that's happening now is not like the learning that was happening before. So, I don't see us continuing with final exams if we continue on this path of remote learning.
Yeah, and that's a question I think that has come up around curriculum too. I mean, are you expecting your teachers to cover all the curriculum that they would have covered if they had been in the classroom for the rest of the year?
No, in fact, we've asked them to not cover the curriculum as it was envisioned at the start of the year, and to instead do more enrichment and deeper learning around topics, explore concepts rather than moving along the curriculum in a predictable way. And we've seen our students really experimenting in very different ways and being very creative and taking control of their learning. Just a few examples are that we have lots of students, as some other districts do as well, making masks for, on 3D printers to help our healthcare professionals. We had some students making headgear that helps health professionals not be uncomfortable. So this particular device they developed on 3D printers that they can wrap around the straps on headgear to make it more comfortable. We have students in the lower grades reflecting and thinking metacognitively about their work and posting those videos to a wider audience. So they're talking about what those mathematical concepts mean to them. And I heard that in both Stacy and Abby's comments. It's exciting to watch them develop in unique ways. We have Spanish, students learning Spanish by talking to doctors who are speaking to them about what's going on in the country in Spanish. There's all kinds of different, very creative and exciting explorations for students and staff.
Yeah, that's great. And what I hear there is a lot of focus on what we might call 21st century skills, or just skills that students are learning. Abby, can you talk a little bit about your work and the emphasis on skills, not instead of the content, but in addition to the content, and that this may be a great time for students to be working on those skills rather than really only doing content?
Yeah, I love that. Thanks so much. I found myself saying over and over again in the last couple of weeks, like, this is a time to lean into a graduate profile or a vision of a graduate. We talk about this idea of when a school or a district can land on a set of skills that they think is deeply relevant to their community. And it is important to have that sort of that choice process, that becomes a really amazing list of skills. And if was no better time than right now to have students reflecting on how are they being self-directed? How are they relying on their critical thinking? How are they being problem solvers? How are they using creativity, right? Like, so the idea of having skills at the same level as content, I always say that when a graduate profile or a vision of a graduate is implemented deeply, actually teachers and parents and students see that content is the vehicle for the skill, right? We teach critical thinking through science or some version of that. And so I think this is a moment for the idea about final exams or any type of activity where students are talking about their work, to be reflective about what are the skills that they're drawing on. Students can do this on a daily or weekly basis. If they do a basic reflection at the end of each day, and this could work for elementary school students all the way up to high school students, like, just track what you did during the day. Which skills did you use, and how can you give us evidence, right? Because the thing that you get to sort of, when it becomes more rigorous and has high expectations, is when you sort of force young people to have an evidence-based argument. So they're using their own work as evidence, but they're making a case about what are these skills that they're using, how are they growing, and how are they becoming more aware of how those skills help them to move through the tasks that they're being asked to do. Because that's what adults do in the adult world as well. So we think it's going to prepare students for life beyond school, as well as helping them to sort of acknowledge the growth that they're experiencing right now.
And if I could jump in there, I so agree with that. And I think the vision of a graduate can be such good organizing, provide a really good organizing function for the faculty, for the community, et cetera. But I love what Abby was talking about at the end there around students thinking about their evidence and then sort of, and then pulling that together, because I think it's really important for students to think about how are, and frankly schools, to think about how are they telling the story of this spring. So even if you don't yet have a vision of a graduate to organize it underneath, thinking about what is the evidence, what have I learned, what have I been doing, how do I tell that story? You know, when we've talked with admissions folks, and we won't go too deeply into this, Allison, but you know, they're really curious. They want to know the story. They want to know what evidence or what stories the students can bring. And so we think that's really important. And I'm very hopeful that the states will start to wrap their heads around that same thing and ask schools to tell the story of what's been going on, as opposed to push back towards tests.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I see some questions in the Q&A about rigor. How do we ensure rigor? And I think part of that too, you know, and for Julie, just to ask Julie, like, how have you been answering parents' concerns about rigor? And I think, you know, last week we were on another webinar about grading that Stacy's organization organized, and the woman who was running the webinar said, you know, if I was going to be judged on my job performance for the last 5 weeks, I don't think I would want that. You know, I think we're in this time when things are just so up in the air for all of us. You know, would any of us really want to be judged based on the performance that we've had over the past 5 weeks? So, Julie, could you speak to a little bit about how you've answered parent concerns about the move to a different type of grading, maybe a little bit backing off on curriculum? What have you said to them when they have expressed concerns, which I'm sure they have?
I've had a few. I think what's most important is kind of what was in Abby's answer a few minutes ago, and that is that rigor, when it's not in a traditional structure or traditional educational sequence, is found in creative ways. And when we're asking students to reflect, we're asking them to take ownership of their own learning, to me, you're getting at more of the critical thinking skills that are even more rigorous than the passive experience that happens when curriculum and content is delivered. And what we've found is that it can be really challenging for the great student, this type of environment. And by the great student, I mean the student who knows how to do school, who is very accustomed to getting an A, who says, just tell me what to do, I'll do it, and then I can deliver, exactly as you instructed me. And for those students, and there's a handful, they've really struggled in this remote learning environment because they don't typically, at least for some, have the experience of being in charge of their own learning, of reflecting on that learning, of saying who they are as a result of the experience they've had, and those kinds of things. Alternatively, we have seen the student who is more disengaged in school, traditional school, who doesn't necessarily speak up, now is taking ownership, and this is particularly at the middle and high school levels, of their own learning, and they're excited by what's happening, and they're able to contribute. And when we reflect on this, I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and some of it has to do with this technological environment can feel safer to them, so they're more willing to take a risk in that sense. And it also creates, we talked about equity early on, but the equity in the platforms and the experience, I think, is greater through remote learning than it can be even sometimes in traditional schools, where you may see 25 students sitting in rows and you can miss people. Here, this is so new and different that our educators are needing to pay close attention to the experiences that students have and build relationships even more strongly than before. So that's exciting. And the last thing I'll say is that in terms of staff being evaluated on this 5-week experience, what we've ended up doing for staff is to basically default to passing for staff as well, unless there's a particular concern. And the reason we're doing that is because we want people to take risks. They're doing amazing things. They have learned, our staff have learned in the last few weeks more than we've probably learned in several years because they've had to. And so letting them experience, just like with our students, without fear of failure, without thinking that they could lose their jobs because they made one faulty move, I think is really important at this time.
Great, thank you so much. Abby, I'd like to ask you, we had a question in the chat. Are there discipline-specific assessments or activities, tasks that are ready to use that we could access? Can you talk about the resources that your organization provide, and maybe give us some of those? We can put them in the chat and add them to the resources.
Sure thing. And actually, earlier in the chat, somebody already added this, but there's an amazing resource called the Performance Assessment Resource Bank. It's lovingly referred to as PARB, and it was developed by Stanford, actually the Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity. And that's an incredible resource bank of performance assessment tasks that are more discipline specific. And you can search for them by grade level, by the length of time that it will take, by all sorts of things. Now, let's be honest, this resource bank was created many, many years ago. And so some of these tasks might not be appropriate in a distance learning situation. So these are not specifically designed for distance learning, but it is a great resource. And PBL Works, yes, somebody else is saying that. PBL Works is also an incredible resource that has projects and assignments that are related to project-based learning. Their library of projects is wonderful. They've got tons of videos and things like that that you can look to. I would say that beyond those two, which are sort of larger, what we're trying to do at Envision Learning Partners is now release tools that are helpful in a virtual defense environment. So if you're thinking about moving to an assessment that would be more of like sort of a cumulative assessment at the end of this year, where students are bringing forth work and reflecting on what that work says about them, then you could go to envisionlearning.org and find tools there. So I would say those are the different things that we're thinking about. But I really do, to go back to something that Julie was saying about rigor, I think if schools are sort of wondering about rigor and considering the idea of a portfolio defense or a capstone project or something like this in the virtual space, what I always say is, you know, I learned portfolio defenses because as a teacher, my students had to graduate by portfolio defense. And at our school, these were 10th and 12th graders. So they did it from 10th grade to move up and then 12th grade to graduate. And they stood in front of a panel of their peers and teachers for an hour, defending their readiness to move on. I never did that as a high school student. And I would tell them that. I'd be like, guys, I don't even know if I could do what you all are doing. And so if we think about rigor, when students are faced in a very authentic way of talking about what they know and supporting that with evidence, to me, that is so much more rigorous than filling out a bubble test or even writing an essay test or anything like that, because it's live in the moment. They're being asked question and answers. And you can do this in any version. You can have a 5th grader do a 10-minute defense. We have people all over the country that are asking students K-12 to do this type of thing. So I just wanted to make a little bit of a pitch for that in terms of the final exams and the rigor.
Terrific. And a lot of resources are going through the chat. We'll make sure that we get all those things that she just talked about and add those to the recording, the link to the recording that will come to you. So if you missed it, we'll make sure we get that back. We've had a few questions about early years, and we did talk about this in 2 webinars ago. We sort of talked about elementary, but do any of you have advice or thoughts about how to approach the early years online learning and or performance assessment for early years students? I don't know who wants to start, but. All right, Abby, great.
Sorry, I'll start. I just wanted to say again, I'll make a pitch for any type of sort of virtual performance assessment. I know many schools do student-led conferences, and some of the most powerful student-led conferences I've ever seen have been with kindergartners who are sitting with a family member or caregiver and an adult from the school and are talking through their work. If you go to Expeditionary Learning, they actually have some wonderful videos. They're a network of schools that really believes in student-led conferences, and they've sort of leaned into that. And they've got some great example videos of young people sort of talking through their learning, again, using pieces of work. And so I think that for the elementary grade, the same idea of having a student do a virtual performance assessment is absolutely possible and powerful. So I'll just say that and leave room for the other panelists to jump in.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add, and I think Abby captured it, is, stepping back to what do students need and how do you support them, I think is the right first answer there, right? So, we have a 5-year-old staying with us right now, and she gets online with her very small class from New York. And I will say the connection to, for those students, for the little ones, the connection to their friends and to their teacher in this moment where they've just been knocked out of their routine is incredibly powerful for them. So yes, they then have some activities around, liquids and solids and Jell-O and all sorts of things that maybe they're taking on or they're not, but the very sort of nature of every once in a while being able to see their teacher interact with their friends is something that they need and something that lets them get some of their other routines down. And as you get older, that can transition. So you can go from, some activities where students are doing sort of some of the core skills and what they're building to, by the time you get to 5th, 6th, 7th grade, students are really able to engage in projects, to take on work on their own, and then come back and talk about it in interesting ways. So I think, centering around what do students really need first, and then thinking about that continuum of student progressions will get you to the right sorts of activities. Great.
I'm going to shift gears, Julie, if that's okay, unless you have something that you want to do. Okay. So, so this is for Julie. I mean, people are sort of thinking about what if this continues into the fall? Do you think that your strategy might change, with maybe more time over the summer to get prepared, to think about it? Have you had, I know it's early, but have you had any preliminary conversations about what happens if we go into the fall in some sort of a distance learning format?
Yes, we've begun in a preliminary way planning for the fall. We can't obviously continue in the same exact way that we would be, because we do have to pay attention to sequencing of classes and what kinds of curriculum will help people access. I think the way that we're talking about it now is to think about maybe identifying standards that are more important, which we've done at the elementary level. They had standards-based report cards. We identified certain standards that are more important than others so that we can focus on, the amount of time that we have available. And then taking that concept to middle school and high school is what I would see happening in the fall. So identifying, the key concepts that need to be taught. Also, we've begun thinking about how do we make up for lost time, and there are concepts that kids need to know, and there are going to need to be adjustments to the curriculum in the fall to cover important things that are missed, as well as important things ahead. So I see our strategy changing. I see it leaning more into a standards-based environment and mastery of concepts and determinations of that sort. And that's going to take a lot of work. So, we're thankful that we may have the summer to kind of be thoughtfully planning along those lines.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Abby, we had a person that said, portfolios sound great, but is this the right time to be trying to shift to a whole portfolio assessment? Can you just address that briefly in terms of maybe small steps that they could take?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that was sort of our thinking when we designed the toolkit of having these different levels. I think you're right. If you've not been building towards a portfolio, now might not be the time to shift completely to that. But I also think that the idea of having students choose, right? We talk about the power of a portfolio like an artist portfolio. The portfolio is taken from the art world, right? An artist decides, here's my point of view. They make a ton of work that they think sort of illustrates that point of view, and then they choose the best pieces that they would put on the wall or put in a book or what have you. Students going through that process of curation is incredibly powerful, whether they are 5, whether they are 10, or whether they are 15. And so I think even if you don't have a fully built out portfolio system, if you say, again, we're going to really lean into your creativity. We've decided that that's the skill we really want you to think about between now and the end of the year. And go back to the work that you've been working on before school closed, as well as what you've done since school has closed. Because I've got to imagine that students are like being really creative right now. Again, right? Like they might have to take care of their siblings. They might have to figure out how to feed a family of 5 with, a certain amount of food that's coming in different intervals. So to sort of say, just give us 3 examples of work that you think illustrates your creativity and talk about that in some way. And again, we can make lots of accommodations for students if they don't have strong Wi-Fi, if they don't have a device at home. But the process of curation is such a powerful thing that I think even if you don't have this like really extensive portfolio system, you can have students pick a couple pieces of work and talk about what that work says about them and get the same transformative experience, and also know what they know, and they know what they know too.
That's great.
Yeah, and if I saw this go by in the comments, but just to give it a shout out. So I love what Abby's talking about, and I think part of what she's talking about in the curation process is that process of reflection, right? It is the process of reflection, is the process of thinking about what you've learned and knowing what you've learned. And that sort of metacognitive evaluation and reflection on your learning is super, super powerful in the variety of forms that it could take. So I think, when you think about it in those sorts of simple terms, any time is a good time for students to be reflecting on the work. And to Abby's point, the process of curation is one really interesting way to do that.
And the process of curation is also about synthesis. And that's the higher level thinking, and that gets at the rigor that we were talking about before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen some questions go by about motivation. You know, how do we keep students motivated? And one thing I know we had talked about previously was the idea of feedback, that I think students are motivated by feedback from the teachers. So whether it's grades or just, hey, that's great, and let me ask you a question. And, you know, so I think that feedback and especially on those reflective experiences can be really powerful. Well, we have just 5 minutes left. Our hour has flown by, and I apologize for those people we weren't able to answer all the questions. But I'd just like to end by asking each of you to share, you know, what are your hopes, or what do you hope will come out of this time? What do you, you know, sort of, if we were to, you know, look forward a year or 2 years, what do you hope may have changed as a result of this very unique experience of COVID-19? Who wants to start?
I'll start.
Great.
I am really hoping that we will take this as an opportunity to do things differently. When we think about how hard it is to change schools and how hard it is to try something new, and we're given this challenge through the pandemic, I'd like to think that there are things that we've learned that we can bring into the future with us, and great conversations like, what does metacognition mean to kids? How do we learn and grow? And all of the traditional parts of academics are very important, those skills, but so too are those non-traditional skills about being good human beings, about being able to contribute to the world, being great thinkers, and to place a higher value and emphasis on skills that aren't typically measured, I think is a wonderful opportunity, and I hope we think about that and preserve some of that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Abby? Or Stacy? Sorry, Stacy was right.
I can jump in. We'll give Abby the last word here. You know, I think I really do think in this crisis is an opportunity, and we've seen a number of schools. We've seen work like the work that Julie and her team are doing. We've seen folks take a moment to say, okay, like in this moment where we have to do things radically differently, it's an opportunity to ask the bigger questions. And so my hope is we all use that bigger opportunity and we start transitioning to a world where we are more focused on the care of students. We are more focused on thinking about the fewer, deeper things, the vision of a graduate, what is really super important, and that we transform the way we then are supporting students towards that to be really focused on guidance and helping them push that direction and helping all students actually really, truly achieve their full potential. And if we move even a little bit that way, that we will have made something out of this spring for sure.
Terrific. Thanks. Abby.
Yeah, Julie and Stacey, thank you so much. I agree with so much of what you said. And so all I do is talk about skills. So yes, I hope that public education across the world has realized that what we need to be doing is having school be the place where students learn the skills that they're going to need when they go into the world after school. And content is the vehicle, but it's not the center anymore. That this is a moment to really acknowledge that, at least in this country, school has not changed significantly in over 100 years. And so let's take this moment to change it. So the one thing that I would add is I really do hope that this is going to be an opportunity where in this country we do center the voices of our most marginalized students more. I think this is a chance to recreate systems, to redesign systems that don't recreate inequity, right? We know that there are so many students in this country that are not getting what they need, not because it's their fault, but because of the world in which they live. And so this is a chance to really center their voices and figure out how we can meet their needs better.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all three of you. And I'll turn it back to Cam just to wrap up for us.
Thank you, Allison. We'd like to thank you guests, our guests. You guys were really fantastic. This was a great treat for all of us. Abby Benedetto from Envision Learning Partners, Stacy Caldwell from Mastery Transcript Consortium, and Dr. Julie Hackett, Superintendent of the Public Schools in Lexington, Massachusetts. We want to thank you for contributing your time and your expertise to this virtual global forum. And thank you all for joining us. Don't forget, you can continue this conversation on Twitter using the @NEASC Forum hashtag. Our next global forum will be held on Tuesday, April 28th, and will be a student panel. We have invited students from New England and around the world to share their recent experiences and perspectives on transitioning to distance learning during COVID-19 school closures. It will run for approximately 1 hour and begin at 9 a.m. in New York City, 2 p.m. in London, 5 p.m. in Dubai, and 9 p.m. in Shanghai. Keep an eye on your inboxes for your invitation. Please share it with your colleagues, submit your questions, and join us next Tuesday. So for our panelists, my co-host Allison Geary, and everyone at NEASC, I'm Cam Staples, and thank you very much.